Welcome back to another episode of Remember the Great Sports NBA 2K18 roster updates video. Today we're going to focus on the Miami Heat, but what I wanted to say was, before I got started, was I was debating on continuing making these videos only because NBA 2K19 is out now, and there are additional changes to the NBA 2K19 game. So some of these changes on here can also be made on NBA 2K18 and 19, but being that a lot of people don't have 2K19 yet, it's still full price in the stores. Usually the price doesn't go down until after Christmas time. I feel a lot of people are still playing NBA 2K18, so I decided to continue forward with making videos. So here we are. We're going to talk about the Miami Heat today. This is actually a very solid roster put together by the NBA 2K team. There's not a whole lot of additions that need to be made, at least in my opinion. I go back to, you always can make whatever additions you like, but I try to make this the most optimal roster that I can. And this is the stock roster I will share with you. You know, you got Shaquille O'Neal, Alonzo, Wade, LeBron, Tim Hardaway at the point, Chris Bosh, Glen Rice, Rony Seikaly, Hassan Whiteside, Eddie Jones, PJ Brown, Steve Smith, Udonis Haslem, Brian Grant, and Thunder Dan Majerle. Okay, now going through this list, you're going to see a few things that I see as a problem. Now, one of the biggest issues that I have with this team, the way it sets is you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centers on this team. Okay? What basketball team ever carries 5 centers? You might carry 3, maybe 4 if that's the 15th man on your roster, but not 5. So there needs to be some changes and some changes to positions. For example, PJ Brown could be listed as a power forward instead of a center because he played some power forward in his career. So we will make those changes, but the two people that I want to focus on that I decided to take off this team, the first person that I decided to take off the list is Thunder Dan Majerle, because he spent 5 seasons with the Heat. But as you can see from his stats, those weren't the best seasons of his career. You know, obviously his time in Phoenix, he was much more of an impactful player, where by the time he was in Miami, he wasn't the Dan Majerle that he was. The second person is Brian Grant. Brian Grant spent 4 seasons in Miami and was a very good ball player, but being the fact that we have 5 centers on this team, there's too many big men, so one of them's got to go. Brian Grant has to leave the team also because there's just too many big guys on this team. I felt it came down between Brian Grant and Udonis Haslem, but being that Udonis Haslem has been with the Heat for like 15 seasons, I feel that he's kind of like Mr. Heat, kind of like Dwyane Wade. So, you know, Brian Grant only spent, I want to say, 4 seasons with the Heat. So even though Brian Grant may be the better player, I just feel that Udonis stays on the team because of his longevity with the organization. So with that being said, stay with me and I will show you the changes to the roster. Alright, so here we are on the roster change. Okay, and this would be the starting lineup. I put Shaquille O'Neal as the backup center. Only because when he was with the Heat, he was a little bit later in his career. Not that Shaq Diesel wasn't a good player, but I put Mourning ahead of him on the Heat list at center. But Shaq is definitely a great backup center for this team. Chris Bosh at the power forward. LeBron James, of course, at small forward. D. Wade at shooting guard. And the point guard at Tim Hardaway. The other thing that I wanted to point out before I loaded this is there's another thing that's lacking on this stock roster, and that was a backup point guard. I mean, you can't have 5 centers and 1 point guard. I mean, what are you going to have, Shaq play the point? I mean, or Hassan Whiteside? I mean, that doesn't make sense. So again, that's why Brian Grant had to leave, and I actually added a point guard, and I'll get to that in a second. The backup small forward is Glen Rice. Very good shooter. Instant offense off the bench. He was originally drafted by the Heat, as you can see. He averaged over 20 a game 3 seasons with the Heat before he went to the Charlotte Hornets, which, he's also on the all-time Charlotte Hornets team as well. So, Glen Rice, Rony Seikaly is the backup center, I guess. You can also, I added, one of the suggestions I make is you actually add him as a center / power forward, if you see up in the top screen under position there. That way he can come in off the bench and play the power forward as well, even though I don't think he ever played power forward in his career. But Rony Seikaly was the big man for the Miami Heat when they became an expansion team. Him and Glen Rice were the 2 top dogs, so to speak, for those Miami Heat franchises in the early 90s, late 80s. So Ronnie definitely has to make this team. Here's the point guard that I added. This is current point guard for the Miami Heat, Goran Dragic. Dragic is an NBA vet for about 10 years. I don't think that age is correct up there. That can't be if the guy's played 10 years in the league. But as you can see, he's bounced around a little bit. But since 2014-15's trade to the Heat, he has basically been the go-to guy on the Miami Heat for running the point. He averaged 20 a game in 16 and 17. 17-18 was also a pretty good season for him, and I'm sure 18-19 will be too. But this is definitely a good backup point guard, which this team does not have. I will note that in NBA 2K19 they did make this correction, though. Goran Dragic is on this team. So if you're doing this for NBA 2K19, you don't have to make this addition. Eddie Jones is a backup shooting guard. Jones is going to show up on a couple teams on this game. The Miami Heat, he had some great seasons. He spent 5 years there. This was kind of a toss-up between Dan Marley and him. They both spent the same amount of their career, 5 years with the Heat, but I felt Jones had better numbers than Dan Marley did. P.J. Brown, the big thing that I mentioned earlier, is I changed him to the power forward on this team, so he'd be the power forward coming off the bench, backing up Chris Bosh. He played a little power forward in his career. This is a good rebounding, defensive guy on your team. You're not going to get a lot of offense out of this, out of PJ, but you don't really need it when you have Dwyane Wade, LeBron James, Shaq, Alonzo Mourning on your team. So this would be your defensive specialist off the bench. The 12th guy on the roster, Hassan Whiteside. Hassan Whiteside is probably going to go down as one of the best Heat ever, if not better than Alonzo Mourning. Maybe when his career's over, maybe. I mean, in case he gets injured, that may not happen. But, as of right now, he's on the team. He's just not in a starting role. Finally, the 13th man is Steve Smith. Steve Smith was a great ball player. He's also on the Hawks all-time team. And if you can see, he also was on the Heat early on when Rony Seikaly and Glen Rice were running the show. He was also a catalyst for those early 90s Miami teams. And, I talked about Steve Smith in the past. He's a good defender. He can throw a three-pointer in there, but a good guy to have on the bench. But as you can see, I allocate 0 minutes during the game to him because, there's not really a place for him on this team, in my opinion. So finally, your reserve list, and this is where Dan Marley gets eliminated. I actually put Mario Chalmers in his place because, again, it goes back to we don't have any point guards on this team. So Mario Chalmers played a long time for the Heat, about 6-7 years, something to that extent. Maybe even almost 10 years. I have to look it up. I apologize, Mr. Chalmers, if I'm wrong. But Mario was a very important integral role for the success of the Miami Heat for many years. I don't think he's still playing. I know he was on somebody's roster last year. I'm not sure if he signed on with anybody this year or not, but he definitely goes down as one of the greatest Miami Heat players. And also we talked about Udonis Haslem. Now again, I've said this in many videos, the 14th and 15th spot on this roster really don't matter because they're not on your bench when you play the game. The reason that Chalmers and Haslem are on here is they're on the game, but you know, you don't have to put them on your reserve list if you don't want them there. So with that being said, whoops, that was the Hawks. With that being said, the coach shouldn't be any surprise to you. Erik Spoelstra. Pat Riley brought him a championship, but Erik Spoelstra has been at the helm for many, many years with the Miami Heat. He's won a championship with them, still coaching there to this day. I don't think you can find a better coach in Miami Heat history to, you know, be on this team. So, again, this team, you know, very, very basic. You know, NBA 2K19 or 2K18, excuse me, did a very good job of putting this roster together. They're just, I think, some of the birthdays are just a little off. You know, like I said, Goran Dragic. I know he's older than 24. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but but anyway, so that's the Miami Heat. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, not a lot to do on the Heat, and stay tuned next time for the next video. Thanks.